So, what are we going to do in the next 50 minutes? Let me go over a quick agenda. What we'll do is we'll go over some of the SCADA basics, and the reason for that is there is some confusion in the SCADA world about what SCADA systems are. What this person may think SCADA is would not be the same as some other person would think about it. So we'll go over some SCADA basics. We will look at some of the threats that affect SCADA security. Where are the threats coming from? Where are the vulnerabilities? Why do they exist? And how can we protect against them? So we'll look at a little bit of that. We'll look at some of the challenges to securing SCADA systems, and finally look at some of the recommendations or proposals that we have. Oh, and last but not least, I'll introduce an updated version of a new open source tool that we are just releasing with SCADA. So, I started working on SCADA systems about 5 to 6 years ago. This was a time when Stuxnet didn't exist. By the way, how many of you know what Stuxnet is? Okay. Almost all good, so I don't have to go into details of Stuxnet. For those of you who don't, Stuxnet was a virus which basically targeted Siemens PLCs or Siemens hardware that was used in a specific nuclear power plant. So I started, this all started about 5 to 6 years ago when my boss came to my cube and asked me that, hey Amol, do we have signatures to identify vulnerabilities in SCADA systems? Now, to give you a little bit of a background, what my team does is we create signatures to identify the signatures which go into our vulnerability scanner, and they identify vulnerabilities, possible threats, missing patches, any sort of weakness in our customers' network. So at that time, I knew what SCADA systems were, but was in no position to start writing security signatures for those. So I said, well, let me investigate. I know what SCADA systems are, and I'll get back to you. So as I started talking with people in the industry, some of our customers who had industrial control systems, distributed control systems, I found that there is a lot of discrepancy in what SCADA is actually. So some people call their system as SCADA systems. Some people said, no, these are not SCADA systems. These are purely industrial control systems, or these are distributed control systems. And there are some differences between each of these, but for this talk, I'll be using the term SCADA pretty interchangeably and use SCADA for DCS or ICS. So let me ask you a question. What are the systems that come to your mind when I say this word SCADA? PLCs, okay, that's good.
Industrial control.
Industrial control. Any else? Manufacturing, yeah. So these are the systems that came to my mind like that 5 or 6 years ago. Power plants, oil or gas transmission lines, wind turbines, power generation, and these are all good examples of SCADA systems, the top 3. The rule of thumb that I used was that if you sort of try to grab a SCADA system or hug a SCADA system and you end up grabbing half of the country or possibly half of the continent, then yeah, that's a good possibility that it's a SCADA system. The systems at the bottom are basically what we just talked about, industrial control systems, which include food manufacturing, automobile manufacturing, and so on and so forth. So these systems are pretty huge, but usually they are confined to one physical plant or probably multiple plants, but they are not as distributed as SCADA. But for our purpose, as I mentioned, we'll use these two terms interchangeably. So as I was thinking about SCADA systems, I wanted to find out why this urgent need to add signatures, because remember at that time there was no Stuxnet. SCADA system was not really in the limelight as it is today. So I was doing some investigation on accidents, and there had been a couple of accidents when it comes to SCADA systems. And some of the examples that I have here are root cause analysis of liquid pipeline failures by the US government, power failures by NERC. And these basically go into a lot of detail on what happened, if it was an operator error, if it was malfunctioning of an equipment, or most probably both of them. Maybe the operator panicked and didn't react correctly, so on and so forth. So I said, okay, fine, there have been a lot of accidents in the SCADA systems. And by the way, I'll give you my Twitter handle where you could download this presentation so you don't have to write down all these links. There have been cases of vandalism against SCADA systems, and the example here I have is something close to where I'm based from, is in Portland, where some vandals, they just destroyed some rubber gaskets on an electric supply line. Didn't really knew what they were doing. They were just vandals. They said, okay, let's try to destroy this. I really don't know how they managed to do it, but they did it. It didn't cause a massive power disruption or anything, but the electrical company still had to go in and replace those rubber gaskets, reroute power, temporarily buy power from other companies. So basically caused them a lot of money. So I said, okay, when it comes to, if someone is losing money, that's a good enough reason to secure those resources. There have been a lot of insider threats when it comes to SCADA security, and the example that I have here is a very famous one from Australia. What happened was an incident where a person working at a water treatment plant or a waste treatment plant got fired. And the very next day, what he does is, because he had a lot of the blueprint of the plant, he knew how the system works. Even after being fired, even after not having access to those systems, he had enough information that he basically drained all the bad water into the rivers and flooded some of the parks. Caused a big embarrassment to the waste treatment company and generally to the country as well when such type of things happen. But what I failed to realize at that time was that the real threats to SCADA systems, which what we are looking at today, or what people are calling as an APT. How many of you are pretty familiar with the APT term, advanced persistent threat? So yeah, some of them are. In advanced persistent threat, what basically happens is, the reason it's advanced is because it uses a 0-day. Everyone knows what a 0-day is. 0-day is a vulnerability which does not have a patch. Even the vendor may not know that it's a vulnerability. It's just a security researcher or a hacker, a bad guy or a white hat, has found this vulnerability and no one knows about it. That's why it's called advanced. It's usually is a targeted attack, so it's not a generic worm that tries to grab passwords or steal credit card information. It is almost targeted at you or at your company, because you are of some importance to the attacker. And lastly, it is usually backed by some sort of a state or a bigger agency, country, or something like that, which has unlimited resources. So it's not basically done by script kiddies or people trying to steal money or things like that. So Stuxnet, the virus that I talked about, it falls, and actually that was the virus which coined this term APT. It falls, it sort of matches all the criteria. It was advanced, it used a 0-day vulnerability, it was targeted to a particular nuclear power plant, and it had some state sponsoring behind it. The creators of those viruses had unlimited sort of resources. And the link that I have here is not actually for Stuxnet, it's for the worm Dooku. How many of you have the worm Dooku? So yeah, people who have heard Stuxnet also have heard about Dooku. This was a worm that came after Stuxnet, and it didn't do anything malicious, but it just collected information. And the link that I have here is from Semantic. They did a very nice static reverse engineering analysis on the worm and concluded that from the pattern, from the code pattern, it's almost, they are at least 100% sure that people who wrote Stuxnet also wrote Dooku because of the way it was written. And it didn't do anything harm, but it just collected information. So we still don't know what would happen with the information that it collects. So we were like, okay, we need to write signatures for these. What we usually do when we have such a task is if we have to write a signature for a new database or a new operating system or a new framework, we usually get that device or that database or that operating system in our lab, bang on it till it breaks, and basically create signatures. If there are existing vulnerabilities, it's even simpler. We don't have to find new vulnerabilities. We just add a signature for one of those existing vulnerabilities. But from the pictures that you saw earlier, it was almost impossible to get any kind of a SCADA system in our lab or to get our hands onto electrical power systems and things like that. So what we did was we created a sort of a framework so that our engineers could understand better what these systems are and can write vulnerability checks or signatures for that. And that system looked something like this. On the left-hand side are the devices which are in the field. So these could be thousands of miles away from your main control station, and your control center is on the right. So these are, as you come close to the control center, these are the devices which are in between. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at what these things are. So as I said, on the left are data acquisition devices. So these are basically your sensors, your meters, your field devices. And what they do is usually they collect signals or inputs like temperature, light, pressure. And some of the examples here are of the, I think this is a photo sensor. It senses light. This is, I think, a pressure sensor, and it's a temperature sensor. So what they do is basically these devices could be mounted thousands of miles away on some electrical pole or some gas pipeline or somewhere. Or if it's an industrial control system, it may not be thousands of miles away. It could be inside your organization, inside on some conveyor belts or things like that. They monitor for these parameters and convert them into discrete or analog signals. Then there is a two-way communication between this component, which is the data acquisition component, and the data conversion component. Data conversion includes basically PLCs, like the ones that we saw earlier. PLCs are basically programmable logic controllers, IEDs, or intelligent electronic devices, or remote terminal units. And what these components do is they convert the analog or discrete measures to digital. So the examples here is on the extreme left, there is a PLC, there is a IED, and here there is a RTU. And to just give you a sense of how big these things are, I have included a picture of a man holding a PLC, which is mounted most probably on a electrical, I don't know, on some sort of a pole here. I don't know what that is, but what he has is a PLC. So fine, what happens is data is acquired by this component. There is a two-way communication to this component, which we are looking at, which is the data conversion component, which converts these discrete measures to digital. And then these measures use one of the communication mechanism to transfer all that data to the control center. Now, communication can be wired, wireless, using radio, any of the communication mediums, and it uses one of the SCADA protocols that I have mentioned here. It's said that there are about 100 different SCADA protocols. I've not been able to count actually all 100 of them, but I can definitely at least list 24 protocols if someone asks me, hey, tell me some SCADA protocols. Some famous protocols are Modbus, ICCP, DNP3, and Basically, their function is to communicate the data from this component to the final component, which is the SCADA master. Now, this SCADA master has components like the HMI, or human machine interface. That is the interface where a human being is in front of like a big screen or many big screens and is continuously monitoring alerts. So in a factory, it could be that some operator is 24/7 manned in this station. It's this secure location, and he's like looking for alerts. It's something going wrong. And if something goes wrong, he gets alerted. He can adjust the temperature or pressure or the conveyor belt or whatever that is being monitored. It used to look, the SCADA masters used to look something like this, where you have, as I mentioned, like some terminals and a proprietary type of system. But more and more, it's looking a little bit familiar like this, typical Windows-based system. And more on that later. So these are basically, this was sort of a framework that we used. Everyone following till now, pretty simple. Data gets acquired, converted, communicated, and here controlled by the SCADA master. Everyone okay? Any questions so far? No? All right. So where are the threats? To find out where the threats are, what we did was we first studied the I/O and the remote component, where data gets acquired and it gets converted. Most of the time, these threats require physical access. So the example that we saw, the vandalism example, that sort of falls here, where you require physical access to the sensor to basically vandalize it. But usually, field equipment doesn't generally have process knowledge. So what you could get from the sensor is that valve 16 is on, or breaker 9B is off, or something like that. And without process knowledge, it leads to nuisance disruption. So without knowing what the function of this thing is, without having the blueprint of the system, if I just go and vandalize something, it usually leads to nuisance disruption, but it's not a targeted attack. So our vandalism example is really a perfect example of this. And at least now, we are not seeing a lot of threats in this area. And if any of you know or have heard about threats which are which affect this I/O component, please let me know. So we said, okay, let's focus our attention more on the communication component. There are various threads here. One of the threads is you could manipulate what gets sent from here and change its output so that this guy, the SCADA master, thinks or looks at wrong things. You can change the FEP output, which is basically your HMI input. And there are a lot of protocol threads. Remember, I mentioned that there are about 100 or at least few dozen SCADA protocols. So coming from a computer science background, we said, okay, this is something that we deal with every day. Let's look more at some of the SCADA protocols that are used in communication. So what we decided was to look at, and that's what we are going to look at here. First is a protocol called as Modbus. How many of you have heard of Modbus? So yeah, I see a few hands. The hands, the number of people knowing things are, it's like a funnel, it's going down. But I think it will go up again. So Modbus is a very simple communication protocol. If you know any of the normal TCP/IP client server protocols, Telnet, FTP, or something like that, it's conceptually, it is similar. What you have is you have a client and you have a server. The client sends a request to the server, which is when the server receives it, it's called as an indication. The server responds to the request, and what you get back is called as the confirmation. So very simple client-server protocol, except in case of Modbus, the client is called as the master, and the slave is called as the server. So the client is basically, it could be your HMI system where the operator sits, And the server could be one of your PLCs or IEDs or something like that, where the client, which is the HMI station, asks the server that, hey, tell me the temperature on this particular PLC, or tell me the status of the conveyor belt number 19 or something like that. And then the server would basically respond to that. So it's a pretty simple client-server protocol. We will look at it a little bit in detail, and this is where you would get to see some packet sniff, some zeros and ones and something like that, but I'll try to keep it simple. So what Modbus has is it has application data unit frame and program data unit. Modbus is a pretty old protocol. It's 30 to 35 years old. It was not really, when it came out first, it was not really designed to work on TCP/IP. But what has happened recently as in the last 10 to 15 years, is it has been modified to run on TCP. And the way it runs on TCP is you basically just slap your TCP and the IP header to your Modbus frame, put all your Modbus data into a TCP packet and send it off. So now Modbus can be compared to our well-known protocols like FTP, Telnet, or whatever. It just runs on TCP/IP. So let's forget, for example, all the TCP/IP and those headers part, and let's just look at Modbus for what it is. What the Modbus frame consists of is a Modbus header. Like usually most protocols have some sort of a protocol header. It has a function code and it has data. The header consists of 4 parts. It has a transaction ID, which is 2 bytes. A transaction ID is basically to identify the transaction. So in a day, if I'm going to ask once every hour for a reading from some sort of a sensor, my first transaction ID, I could put it as 100. The next one, I could put it as 101, so that when the server responds, it puts the transaction ID that the client had set, so that the client knows that, okay, this is the answer for the question that I asked. So I'd say, okay, my question number 100 is what is the temperature on blah, blah, blah. And what I'll receive is the temperature on blah, blah, blah is this for your transaction. So pretty simple transaction ID. Protocol ID is again 2 bytes. It's constant. It's 0 for Modbus. We don't have to worry about it. And length is basically the length of the packet. The last 1 byte, which is unit ID, is quite interesting. It basically tells the server which unit I'm referring to. So when I ask for a temperature or pressure or some sort of a reading, I tell that, and this reading is for the sensor number 200, which is connected to you, or the sensor number 500, which is connected to you. So it tells the server which unit I'm talking about. So everyone okay with the header? And again, you don't have to understand each and every bit of it, but it's a pretty simple header. Then there are function codes. We won't go into a lot of details for this, but the function code basically the client tells the server that this is function code 2, which is basically read, or this is function code 6, which is basically write. So basically the client can tell the server, hey, give me the reading, or a client can write a reading, which basically means change the reading. So if I want to change the pressure on something, then I would do a write. Or if I want to do multiple reads, there is a function code for that. And there are about 2 dozen function codes. Basically, what they essentially do is actions. What action does the client want to perform? Does the client want to read data from server? Does it want to write data to the server? So this is a pretty simple example in Perl based on the frame that we saw. The reason I chose Perl was that it's very simple. You can put all of that into this just one line of one page of Perl code, and if you go to C or C++, it would be a lot difficult to explain. So what you do is you just create your buffer with the transaction ID. Here I chose 1, character 1, which would be 256. We put the protocol ID here, which is 0. We put the length of the packet, We put the unit ID, which I chose 1. Let's say I want to talk to unit number 1. I put function code 3, which is read holding registers. So I want to read 5 registers, or I want to read what is the temperature, pressure, whatever it is connected to for 5 registers. And I put the address of the registers that I want to read into, create a socket, send it along to my Modbus server. So if you sniff this request in Wireshark, basically, and by the way, Wireshark and most of the sniffers are pretty good at Modbus. We didn't have to write any custom Wireshark plugins or something like that to decipher this text. Just worked out of the box. So Wireshark said, okay, transaction ID was 256, protocol ID 0, length it's 6. I'm talking to unit number 1. It deciphered 3 as read multiple registers, and word count of 5, which is basically I want to read 5 registers. And the response that I got was this. Basically, it said, okay, this is, it again just echoed back the transaction ID to me, which is 256. It just echoed back the unit ID, and it said, okay, you have 10 bytes of data for the 5 registered that you requested, 2 bytes per request. So what is wrong in this? I mean, do you find anything wrong in this particular code and the client-server communication that happened? No encryption. No authentication. So this is sort of the triangle that usually all protocols or any security system is judged on: confidentiality, integrity, availability. In confidentiality, you have basically authentication and authorization. Authentication as in who you are. Are you really who you claim you to be? And authorization is, okay, fine, you are who you are, but do you really have, are you really authorized to perform this action? And in the previous example, as we saw, there was no authentication or authorization. The client just said that, okay, give me the readings for these registers, and the server gave those readings. There was no access control, as in the server never asked, are you really permitted to do this operation? There was no really integrity checks either. So we said, okay, Modbus was really pretty old, 30, 40 years old protocol. It was not really meant for, it was meant for a different sort of an area. It was meant for industrial control systems. It didn't have security in mind, because at that time the thought process was that this would be a completely sort of air-gapped system, or there were basically no security concerns at that time. So we said, fine. Let's look at a different protocol, or more recent protocol. But before going there, I want to show you a slide of this tool that I mentioned, which we are releasing. The name of the tool is SCADA Scan. And in this screenshot, it is running in the Modbus mode. What it does is it will basically scan for all your Modbus servers on the network, and it will also brute force all the slave IDs. As far as signature writing was concerned, which was basically the task that we started with, we said that, okay, fine, we will say that if any of our customers have Modbus running, we would automatically flag it as a possible vulnerability and say that you better protect your infrastructure with some other, by covering it up with some other security mechanism. So we turned our, everybody pretty okay till now? Still following? Okay. So we turned our attention to a more recent protocol called as DNP3. And don't worry, we won't go into any of these, a lot of these details. DNP3 was designed from the ground up for the electrical system, and it had a lot of improvements on Modbus. So for example, Modbus has this constant polling feature where the client, as we saw in our previous example, constantly polls, hey, tell me the temperature, tell me the pressure, tell me. In DNP3, what happens is, and you get one response for each request. In DNP3, the server can sort of piggyback all the responses into one request. So if you have 5 requests, it can just answer with one response, thus saving on network bandwidth. It had something in which you can tell the server that, hey, tell me the temperature or pressure or whatever, only if it changed. So you don't even have to poll all the time. It has features like timestamping, which the electrical industry really needed. And that is basically in Modbus, when I make a request and I receive a response with that transaction ID, I just have to assume that I made the request at about 4:15 and I got the response, so the temperature must be at 4:15, but there is no real timestamping. So the electrical system couldn't do without timestamping. So here what we have is the client sends a timestamp and the server sends a timestamp that, okay, the temperature, you requested some temperature reading or electric reading, and this is the reading at this time. So a lot of improvements on DNP3. It's a 3-layer protocol. It has application layer, a transport layer, and a link layer. And this is the application layer packet. And again, let's not try to get lost in the packet details, but it has basically same thing as Modbus: a server, a client, a request, a response. So it has similar codes, like similar function codes, read, write, like what we saw in Modbus. It has a transport layer, which tries to provide some transport type of mechanism. And it has a link layer, which is the layer which is at the bottom, which has, which provides basically source address, destination address, and some sort of a CRC. So you have some error checking going on here. So what we did was we did exactly the same thing that we did for Modbus. We created a very simple Perl script. As you can see, it's just like 1 page long. If you literally copy paste this in Perl, it will work. Well, with some headers and things like that. So, and this is from the open source tool that I was talking about. So you basically, again, create a DNP3 packet, put the destination address, source address. Now you are actually calculating a CRC here. Here I've just hard-coded the CRC because I know what the packet is. And you send it away to the DNP3 server. Basically ask, this is the request that you see. Again, in this case, Wireshark, Ethereal. Most of the packet sniffers already knew how to decipher this protocol. You see a request here, which basically requests the link status. So it doesn't ask the server to perform a certain action. It just says, hey, tell me what is the status of the link. Is it up, is it down? And there are a lot of bit fields related to a link, so give me all those. And the response that you see is this, which is basically it says, okay, this is unsolicited response, and this is the status of your link, and there are various bit fields for the status of the link. Same question again that we asked to Modbus. What did it provide? Confidentiality, which has basically authentication. Not really, we didn't authenticate against the server. The server didn't ask us who we were. It just took our request and sent us the reply. No access control or authorization. Some integrity as part of as CRC, but as you know, I mean, it can easily be broken. You can have a lot of man-in-the-middle attacks, but still some sort of a CRC as compared to Modbus. So we again did the same thing. Is if we found DNP3 in our customer's environment, we said that, okay, our signature, it said, okay, you are running DNP3, and this is the screenshot from the open source tool. It basically scans. It was basically trying to find if DNP3 is running. And if it does, then it says that, okay, it's not a very secure protocol, so try to have your security in some other form around this protocol. But well, everything was not lost. What happened was in 2007, DNP3 released a newer specification which had a lot of things that we wanted to see. So it had cryptography in it. It had new status codes, and it had new hashing and so on and so forth. So now when we write a signature, we check if it's just a DNP3 which is running or secure DNP3 that is running, so we can give like a good judgment of how secure that protocol is. So we looked at some of these protocols and said, okay, a lot of protocols are basically they are older protocols, not really designed with security in mind. So what other threats could there be in SCADA systems? We saw some of the physical threats here, where you could go and sort of physically damage something which is maybe miles away. We saw some of the communication threats in the protocols or in the way the client communicates with the server. Now let's look at some of the threats that could affect directly the master systems. Now this is a system, if you recall, in the picture earlier was where there are these lot of screens where a human is looking at these different alerts. It's usually a very secured facility where you either need some fingerprint or some biometric way to get inside, or usually there is a guard standing outside to check your credentials, your ID, your badge, and where the operator is monitoring 24/7 what's happening on the plant floor or what's happening in the system. And the number one threat that we found to the master systems or to the SCADA masters is that they are more and more connected to the corporate intranet or even to the internet. So when Stuxnet hit and it was all over the news, I did a Shodan search. How many of you know Shodan? All right, cool. So Shodan is basically it's a website. You can go to shodan.com. I or Qualys does not manage it. It's from some guy. And it's a scanner. It's a banner-based scanner. So offline, it scans all the public IPs and stores their banners. So if it is a HTTP service, it will store in its database that this IP has this banner. If it's a FTP service, it will store this IP, this banner. If it's Telnet, SSH, it will do this and store it in its database. What you can do is when you go to the website, there is a search button. You can say port 80 string Apache. So it will give you all the live IPs on the internet which have port 80 open, which has the banner that matches Apache. So when Stuxnet hit, I was curious about when I was working on the Siemens and all those things. So I did my little search there. I said, okay, Siemens, PLC, SCADA, let's type it in. Let's type this banner. Let's see what happens. And sure enough, there were some SCADA systems on the internet, connected to the internet, which I could basically access, which gave some of the banners which SCADA systems have. And that is, I mean, obviously it's ridiculous. Shodan also has a top search feature, so you could see what are the searches, what are the top searches that people are doing, and it changes every day, every hour based on the searches people are doing. And it had, after Stuxnet, a lot of searches for Siemens, for PLCs, for SCADA-related things in there. So initially, I was not able to find anything because my search was wrong, but then I just copy-pasted one of the top search, and bingo, I did found some of the systems connected to the internet. So that's the number one threat that we see, that systems are either connected to the internet in the worst case directly, or connected to the corporate network, which is basically your network which the HR system has, or which the admin has, or the reception has. And there is no authentication or per user authentication. So when you go into this room, which has this SCADA controller, you have, as I mentioned, it has some biometric type of fingerprinting, some physical security. But once you are inside there, and when you are in front of those screens, there is no actually security on who can go and press any button. There is no authentication, or there is no per user authentication. And that was fine when these systems were sort of air-gapped or not connected to your intranet. But now, since they are connected to your intranet, the viruses or worms like Stuxnet, they don't need to physically go into the room and do something. They can just jump from your corporate network, which is your network that your receptionists use, your HR system use, your engineers use, onto the SCADA network. And if there was authentication on the SCADA software, at least it provides some layer of defense where the virus would have to know some sort of a credentials to talk to talk here. Of course, it can use protocols that we just saw, because the protocols also don't have any authentication or access control. But using the protocols may be tricky, so a lot of times the virus could just access the HMI system and click these buttons, which usually the operator would do. Of course, this would require the virus to know what SCADA system is being used and how to manipulate it. But from Stuxnet, as we saw, there are viruses written which know exactly how SCADA systems behave. Another issue that we saw was that there were no passwords or default passwords. So if a virus was able to identify that you are running ABB or Honeywell or Rockwell systems, it can easily know what is the default password for that system and get access to it, even if you have some sort of an authentication on it. I was at a SCADA conference, and basically the number one reason for people not having passwords on these systems was that they said that these are critical systems. When there is an alarm, there is a fire going on, or maybe the conveyor belt is stuck, or some emergency that has happened, the operator does not have enough time to input like a long password and then, oops, wrong password, input again the correct password because something really critical has happened there. Like you may have heard of like a PGA, well, again, I don't want to go over specific companies, but gas pipeline bursting. And that's type of an emergency where you don't want the operator to type password and maybe type it wrong to get to that emergency. But again, in the same conference, there was a military, like a US Marines guy, colonel. He said that they have 19-year-old people in the military who input 25-digit long passwords which change every 2 weeks. So of course, being in military, you can enforce a lot of things like that, but I think it's time for us to really think of our critical infrastructure as being military, because it is of that importance. Many times we saw there was no patching on these SCADA systems, and this is a very interesting issue as far as SCADA is concerned. A lot of earlier, like a few years ago, many of these SCADA systems were proprietary hardware and software. So there was no question about patching or things like that. But in the 90s, when Windows became the predominant operating system, what many of the SCADA owners asked their SCADA vendors is, why don't you port your system to Windows? Because it will be, well, cheaper. That's what the vendors did, that they ported a lot of their systems to, or their master here, the control systems, to run on Windows. So the HMI is not like a proprietary screen and buttons, but it's just a Windows desktop. Windows has good graphic capabilities. It can show all these alerts and people can react to it. But the downside of that was, and that was still even fine when there was no internet in the, well, in the early days, Windows 3.0 or Windows 2.9. But now when these systems run off-the-shelf operating system like Windows, and they are connected to the internet, that's a pretty deadly combination, because they get exposed to all the attacks, malware, and worms that could affect a Windows system. And on top of that, you have to patch Windows systems. And now I think this is the question where a lot of hands will go up. How many times does Microsoft release a patch? Per year, per month, per week?
Patch Tuesday.
Patch Tuesday. So everyone knows that, because all of us are affected by Patch Tuesday. So every Patch Tuesday, when Microsoft releases a patch, I have to patch my SCADA hardware. I don't feel too comfortable running a patch on a system which controls critical infrastructure. On top of that, there is no guidance from my SCADA vendor on what that patch would do, if that patch is really safe to apply on my SCADA system. So if I'm a SCADA engineer, my vendor doesn't tell me if that patch is safe to install or not, I most probably wouldn't install that patch. This leads to a lot of systems not being patched and being exposed to a lot of vulnerabilities. Another issue here is many times my SCADA system doesn't run like a plain Windows that all of us use. It runs some modified version of Windows by the SCADA vendor. So what happens is when Microsoft releases a patch, the vendor has to sort of recompile and re-release the patch for that vendor's implementation of Windows. And as you can see, it takes a lot of time. When Microsoft releases a patch, then the vendor releases the patch, then I get it, and then I install it. We have already seen, we as in, now I'm going to refer a little bit to my company, is Qualys has already seen that the time to exploit a vulnerability after the patch is being released is getting less and less. The people or hackers, when a patch is released, they can sort of bin diff or do a binary diff of the patch and try to guess what was changed and write worms or malware to take advantage of that vulnerability, assuming that you are not patched. So being unpatched is really bad these days. There are systems that we saw that were not restarted in years. And when we asked, like, why have you not restarted this system in years? The simple answer that we got was that they were not sure that the system will come back up again if they restart it. And this is your critical infrastructure system. So it's, even I chuckled at the time, I had a little laugh, but it is a fact, and it is, we saw a couple of systems that are like that are running Windows NT, Windows 2000, and systems which are actually obsolete and for which patches are no longer there. Since these systems are now more or less Solaris or Windows or more off-the-shelf OSs, it has all the problems that we have for common IT systems, like unnecessary services. The system has to be now really hardened because it's a general-purpose OS, not a specific OS. So to just go over some of the things that we saw was that the number one challenge for SCADA system, apart from the use of off-the-shelf operating systems which were connected to internet, is this, which is the long life cycle of a SCADA system. A SCADA system, whenever it's installed, is usually meant to last for at least 10 years, a decade, or multiple decades. You cannot just change the entire, forget about changing the entire system, but even parts of the system in a few decades. If it was something like my laptop, which gets outdated every 2 years, that was no problem. For 2 years, I'll just somehow bear with it, and after that, I'll get a new secure SCADA system. But that's not the issue here. SCADA systems are meant to last for decades. It's difficult and costly to upgrade even parts of the system. This is what we just talked, no testing guidance from vendors. Some systems are even managed by vendors. So if, as security consultants, you go to pen test a system or you go to scan a system, you see it's a Windows box. Windows, we have seen Windows many times. Give us the credentials and we'll tell you how it's doing. They don't have the credentials because it's managed by their vendor. There are other systems in this network, the master network, which has basically data historians, which stores all the alerts that are happening. They are also nothing but your off-the-shelf databases, Oracle, MySQL, MS SQLs, things like that. And they are also susceptible to the same patching loop which we just saw. This is something interesting. In almost all instances, we saw when we go in from the IT's perspective. So some manager in IT says, okay, let's try Qualys on our SCADA network. They bring us in, and then there are these SCADA engineers or system engineers who manage this system, and they never get along. And initially we thought that, okay, fine, this is just something human beings don't get along, not a new thing. But when we observed it in each and every instance, what had happened in most of the cases was that some IT engineer, without really understanding what that system is, because he had a piece of paper from his management that, yeah, go and secure SCADA system, ran a blind scan on the SCADA system. These systems are very fragile, they have very less processing power. Many of those PLCs, if they see a packet that they don't know of, if you just ping them, they will fall down because they were not designed to receive unexpected packets as simple as a ping packet. And because of this, the system engineers say that, oh, you, because of your scanning, I had like a few hours of downtime in my factory floor. You are never going to scan my system again. And this difference between IT and system engineers basically lead to the system being left unsecured. So if you are an IT person, if you have the task to scan a SCADA system, first really know what you are scanning. Ask your vendor if their tool has ever scanned this type of a SCADA software before, and is it safe to do it? And even if the vendor says that it's safe to do it when there is a maintenance window. Like every factory or industrial floor has a few hours of maintenance once every quarter or once every month to clean up all the parts or things like that. So take that opportunity to do it. This is changing wrong mentality. I think Stuxnet has sort of changed the mentality and brought SCADA to SCADA security to the limelight. So having a strategy for a password policy, access control would help. Having a strategy for software upgrades and patches would help. Having a SCADA test environment would help. And again, these are very easy proposals, easy for me to say. They are not by any means or way easy for SCADA system owners, because having a test environment which mimics at least half or 40% of what the real system does will cost you a lot of money. And getting those different approvals and getting a test system of, if any of you maintain a SCADA system would know that there are very few people who have actually a test system where you can test out your patches or where you can test out things before applying to the SCADA network. Demand from your SCADA vendors that they expedite testing of various patches and say that, okay, this patch is safe to apply, go ahead and apply it so that things are not, hosts are not left unpatched. Demand secure protocols, and also not just demand it from your vendors, but make sure that you are running secure protocols, because we have seen way too many times in SCADA or even in our regular IT sort of network is that, okay, your systems run all the latest and the greatest secure protocols, or they have those protocols, but they are not enabled. So even though you have secure DNP3, still the communication is happening just in DNP3. It's not just a checkbox on paper saying that, okay, I have secure protocol, but it has to be running. And generally apply your, since SCADA systems are starting to look more and more like usual IT systems with off-the-shelf operating systems like Solaris, Linux, Windows, apply your experience from your IT network management and security to SCADA system. That I think will go a long way. Auditing and training, periodic scanning of these systems would also work. So finally, last slide, this is the tool that we are releasing. It's called SCADA Scan. It's in the alpha version. It currently works on Modbus DNP3. In the beta version, we want to write signatures to identify master vulnerability threats. And in the final version, we want user configurable signatures, because at the end of the day, we as a vendor, or no one is going to see all type of SCADA systems because there is a lot of diversity. So if the community comes together and uploads their fingerprints or run the tool and uploads their fingerprint to the tool, that would go a long way, and that's the ultimate goal of this tool. So where to find this tool? That's the link for the tool. I also tweet a lot of updates about the tool, as well as a lot of security incidents that are happening. So if you follow me on Twitter, that you could get updates about the tool. And finally, there are some blogs here which would describe, which has security implications for SCADA system, or how to secure your SCADA systems. There is a blog called as some 6 sins of SCADA systems, and a lot of other good security related original blogs here. So with that, a great thank you, and I'll open this up for any questions. I can hear you.
Yeah, I can shout. Of the hosts that you identified on Showdown, did you actually investigate what any of them were?
No, we didn't investigate more. We did try to contact some of them or try to find whom they belong to so that we could contact them. But that was the investigation. We didn't do basically any pen testing, or we didn't try to find any vulnerabilities because I mean, these are SCADA hosts. We don't want to, for our pen testing purpose, maybe bring them down, and we know they are very fragile. There were some, I mean, not in the Showdown instance, but in some other instance, when we asked, like, why are your SCADA hosts connected to the internet? I mean, some of the answers that we received were that, let's say it's an electrical system. They said that we want to tell our customers where the power has been shut down or there is some sort of an emergency. And I mean, I see already a lot of smiles on your faces. It's like you can do that a lot more securely than just connecting the whole thing to the internet and saying that, okay, now my customers can see accurately what's happening. So, yeah.
Cool, thank you.
I'll shout as it's not working. Are you seeing a lot of, it's working, isn't it? Are you seeing a lot of Modbus over TCP/IP? Because in my experience, the wrapper for TCP is not very reliable in a production environment.
It's not reliable, I agree to that over TCP/IP, but we do see some instances of Modbus, typically in smaller systems, industrial control systems, over TCP/IP. But you're right, a lot of systems that we see for Modbus are non-TCP/IP systems as well. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one more.
All right, one more.
Any other questions? Okay.
Well, all right, thank you.
With that, thank you very much, Amol.